One of the things that's happened in recent years is that the government has opened up more and more forest areas to mining, to also, to the tourism industry while
Hmm.
displacing indigenous communities. You can't make fiction into, as it were, the sugarcoating for research or for, a whole world of facts. I don't think anyone would want to read fiction of that kind. Certainly, I would not. At the same time, you can't forget the real world that's around you. And this world is intruding upon everything all the time. So once you see that reality, you can't really unsee it.
Can we expect a novel is something in the works in terms of fiction? Any fiction coming up?
Well, I'm in the process of finishing a novel.
Hello and welcome to Outlook Talks. Today we have with us the wise and erudite writer Amitav Ghosh. Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for taking the time to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, your recently released book, Wild Fictions, is a collection of essays which was written over the past 25 years. And in that, you write about all the historical forces that have shaped the world, the politics, the connections between human actions and climate change, and how we have arrived at this point in time. So, as a keen observer of the earth as well as the human condition, do you see hope for us or are we actually doomed?
I don't. I absolutely do not believe in this hope and doom binary. I think that's completely the wrong way to think about it. There is a certain future coming up ahead of us, and that future is going to be thoroughly disrupted. It's not going to be anything like the world that we knew already. The world that we are in is nothing like the world that I knew growing up, for example. I mean, when I was growing up, this time of the year, the skies were beautifully clear over Calcutta. The air was more or less clean. It was completely different. But, the end of the world as we knew it doesn't mean the end of the world per se. I mean, there's going to be a new world, and, uh, people throughout history have learned to adapt themselves to new worlds. So that's nothing new, and we ourselves will have to learn to live.
But would you say that this is the time of monsters when the new
Hmm.
world is struggling to be born?
Yes, yes, the new world is not yet born, and the old one is dying. And in between is the time of monsters. This is something that Antonio Gramsci said back in the 30s. And I think I'm not the only one saying it. It's like everybody who thinks about these things is saying it more and more often. Because we can all see that, all everything that was normal before has now suddenly become abnormal. And, whether it be in politics or in weather or in, wider climate impacts or whatever. And the really striking thing is that these things are not disconnected. The climate change, in some sense, or the planetary crisis, as I would put it, the broader planetary crisis, these things are or part of a historical pattern of geopolitics. Pattern of geopolitics where the great majority of the world was really subjugated by a tiny minority. So all of this is, in some sense, the outcome of a historic pattern of inequalities.
Speaking of inequality, the development, everything is being done in the name of development. So the model that we are following in India as well as across the world is clearly not working for most of us and for the planet. But what is the alternative? You spoke about the pre-modern times at your lecture, the C.D. Deshmukh lecture in Delhi, which you had delivered recently. What is the alternative? What is the alternative to this development model?
You're asking me questions which are sort of out of my pay grade. I'm a
I mean,
novelist and
what
a
can we
writer.
possibly
Uh,
imagine as an alternative? Because you are very good at imagining the unthinkable and the future. So, what is it that can work? This is clearly not working.
This is clearly not working. It's collapsing, and yet at the same time, it has an incredible momentum because it's making a few people very, very rich. At the cost of the rest of the world. But then you could say that this is exactly what this model of development has always done. The whole plan is to make a few people very rich while impoverishing everyone else. So there's nothing very surprising in it. If we look at the growth of inequality, both within and between nations over the last 3 years of neoliberalism, it's unbelievable. In the United States now, 1% of the population owns almost half the entire economy. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. And that is one of the reasons why we are heading towards these incredible political disruptions, that we see occurring across the planet.
Do you find it strange that we still have leaders? For example, the Donald Trump who has now returned to power, who still deny climate change, call it a hoax, and still go ahead, full steam with all this extraction, drilling, mining. Isn't it odd that, the world is literally burning in front of our eyes, and we still have people in charge who are denying the obvious?
No, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, Donald Trump is not exactly a climate change denier. I mean, he may pose as such right now, but way back in 2009, he actually signed he signed this public newspaper advertisement in the New York Times calling on the government to act on climate change. Because, real estate people, most of all, face a great deal of exposure in getting insurance and so on in relation to climate change. So he's very well aware of what the problems are. So when in fact he says this, when he calls it a hoax and says drill, baby drill,
Yeah.
he's actually saying something which is not quite apparent. Because look at Keir Starmer. He and the Labour Party are said to be big. I mean, they claim to. I mean, they're certainly not climate deniers. They claim to recognize the harms that climate change might cause. At the same time, yesterday he put out he stopped his own MPs from voting on a climate change bill. That would have limited the oil industry. I mean, the fossil fuel industries in many ways. So, this is the weird thing that many many leaders of affluent countries, on the one hand, they pay lip service to climate change, and on the other, they go on as business as usual. So, for example, Norway in this whole period, and Norway is an immensely rich country. They have a huge sovereign wealth fund. I mean, they've grown rich from the fossil fuels that have been found, inside and along their coast. Norway is now opening up more and more of its coastal areas to fossil fuel exploration. Now, if an immensely rich country like that can proceed, I mean, how much richer can they get? I mean, you know, the mind boggles. I mean, if an immensely rich country like that continues to consume enormous quantities of energy, emit enormous quantities of greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, these people continue to lecture people in poor countries about cutting back on on their carbon emissions and so on. How does this make
Mm.
sense?
So the existing political structures that we have, the political parties themselves, they're not able to, forget self-interest, interest of specific nations, and come together to tackle the climate crisis, right? I mean, they haven't really shown any sign of coming together. Even the left part, especially the left parties are also not stepping up.
Well, in the United States, certainly there is a left wing of the Democratic Party which has
Yeah.
been, fairly sort of forward-leaning, but on climate change. But even for them, basically, they are reposing their trust in these market-based solutions.
Hmm.
And as we all know, climate change is itself the greatest market failure. This is universally acknowledged. So how can you expect the disease to be the cure? I mean, it's so contradictory.
So you've been writing consistently fiction and nonfiction through the years, and you've been sort of warning us what is to come. Sometimes you make these uncanny predictions before things happen, like the tsunami, for instance. So we're just wondering what made you think deeply, so deeply about climate change as a writer. You've been like the lone voice for a long time.
Well, actually, in India, we have a very a very large community of environmentalists and thinkers who've been thinking about these things for a long time. The problem is that the mainstream media sort of marginalizes them, so they don't really have a presence within the mainstream. But I simply because I happen to have already published several books, uh, you know, uh, so it's only in that sense that that I was an early voice. However, I will say this that the research for the Hungry Tide really was a turning point in my life. And some of the essays that are in this book, Wild Fictions, comes exactly from that experience, because already back then in 2000,
Yeah.
many signs of the planetary crisis were already evident in the Sundarbans. For example, you could see the effects of sea level rise.
Yeah.
That is, there was saltwater intrusion deeper and deeper into the channels of the estuary. You could see biodiversity loss simply sort of happening in front of your eyes. The last time I was in the Sundarban a year ago, it was really kind of shocking because uh, didn't see many birds. And the bird population of the Sundarban used to be enormous, but now you see fewer
Yeah.
and fewer. So all of that adds up. I mean, you can literally see, these terrible impacts occurring. And, the mangrove forest is just so important for the entire environment of the Bengal Delta. It's a sort of breeding ground for fish. Here in the Bengal Delta, fish are absolutely essential to the lives of people who depend upon an enormous variety of fish for their protein
Yeah.
intake. And that's, we see that dwindling day by day. And more than that, the mangrove forests protect the interior from the impacts of cyclones. This has been its historic role. This is why Calcutta, despite being in a very cyclonically active region, has managed to get through repeated impacts of major cyclones. And, climate change is actually intensifying cyclones. I mean, Cyclone Amphan intensified at an unbelievable rate. In like
Yes.
24 hours, it went from a tropical depression to a category three, I think it was. I forget. So we are seeing more and more phenomena of this kind. And at the same time, we're losing whatever sorts of resiliency we had in the past.
In the great derangement, you had one of the points you had mentioned was that not enough art and literature is being created about climate change and to make people aware of the reality of the plight they are in. So that was published in 2016, The Great Derangement. So with now, do you think that enough is being written, and also that where the words have the power to sort of move us into action? Are they powerful enough to raise awareness, to make us act?
Since 2016, there has been, I would say, an enormous outpouring of writing as well as art
Yeah.
in relation to the planetary crisis. Uh, I don't know what part my book played in it, but certainly, every week I get people sending me many manuscripts saying, you know, your book inspired me, so you have to read my book. Which which is of course impossible. I can't possibly keep up. But I think there has been a big change, a big
Yeah.
recognition that something has very seriously gone wrong. And young writers are grappling with this. I think you'll see, generally speaking, that young people have a much greater awareness of what is happening. than, let's say, people of my generation or even the generations in between. And they realize that, they've been sold a bill of goods, that the world that they thought they were coming into is not what they imagined. So, of course, they engage with it, they think about it, and some of them write about it or, make art about it.
Right. In a previous interview recently, you had said that I see climate change in terms of karma and dharma. This was a recent interview. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I'm sure everyone who thinks about these issues gets this question. I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist, or do you believe that everything is going to be all right, or everything is doomed, and so on, as you asked me right at the beginning? Um, so I don't think it really matters whether you. I don't think optimism, pessimism, again, is the right binary for thinking about this. Even if the future is profoundly disrupted, as we now know it will be, it doesn't really matter. We have to carry on doing what we can. That's our duty, you know. I mean, we should not imagine that it's because we think we can make everything all right, that we can fix everything as it were, that we should address these
Act.
issues. We need to address these issues because, exactly as I said, it's our duty. What we, in our part of the world call karma and dharma.
But it's hard to be not overwhelmed, like it is overwhelming to see, constant floods, constant weather events disrupting your life. So in that sense, you have to be then stoic to sort of take that all in and also act, not just despair, isn't it?
Yeah, you shouldn't. I know it's overwhelming because it's something on a planetary scale. It's hard for our minds. It's hard for us to get our minds around it. But it's important, as you say, not to be overwhelmed, to try and maintain a grip on the reality such as it is, and not to escape into like a fantasy world. As
Yeah.
that's the temptation, that we just slip into. Let's say because it's too hard to face, we just think of ourselves as being somewhere else.
Right. What role do you think there are a lot of people's movements trying to protect the resources of indigenous communities in different corners of India across the world. What role do you think people's movements can play? Like on a realistic, because they are dealing with, forces which are far more powerful than them and which have far more resources.
Let me say that, first of all, these people's movements are very important. And one of the reasons why, say, for example, I have been aware of this crisis for so long is because way back, even when I was a student, there were all these, science for the people movements. Many of my friends who were scientists were involved in them. They were producing critiques of, let's say, Western science and
Yeah.
technology. And these were scientists, and they were warning of the consequences. And that was a very major part of, my education, just being exposed to these movements. These movements became really energized after the Bhopal disaster. So that was also a very major part of the radicalization in relation to these issues that occurred at about that time. And since then, these movements have actually really percolated to the ground level. Many of them have become very important at the ground level. Uh, One such group that I can think of is Kalpavriksh, which is based in Pune
Yeah.
and is, it's been directed for a long time by Ashish Kothari, who's written also some very brilliant books about these issues. So, yes, I think many of these movements have been trying to establish links with uh, Adivasi communities and
Yeah.
so on. But as you say, they're facing overwhelming odds because one of the things that's happened in recent years is that the government has opened up more and more forest areas to mining, to also, to the tourism industry while
Hmm.
displacing indigenous communities. What we are seeing in India is really now an all-out assault upon the environment and on indigenous communities. You know, what they're planning in Great Nicobar Island is just straightaway ecocide.
There is a Dutch philosopher called Mara van der Lugt who has just come out with a new book called Hopeful Pessimism. So the book is titled, I don't know if you've seen it, it's very new. It's called Hopeful Pessimism. And she argues that, in times, desperate times, in very difficult times, people are pessimistic, but out of that pessimism, a certain radical hope is born. And then that becomes a very powerful force to bring them together and to act. Would you agree with that? Do you think that is?
So such books actually. There's a book called Radical Hope and another one
Yes.
called Radical Optimism, I think. So, and basically the arguments are the same that,
Yeah.
out of this despair, some kind of hope is born for action in relation to the future. The problem is, I don't even know what action means at this point.
Right.
What exactly does action mean? Shutting down, you know, uh, the infrastructure. I suppose that's a certain kind of action.
Mm.
But certainly, I don't see any kind of enthusiasm for that in the global south.
Yes.
I don't see that happening. You know, in the West, action is basically conceived of as being focused on fossil fuel corporations. And I think they're right. They're right to focus you know, their activities on fossil fuel consumption. But in the global south, where in fact the per capita consumption of energy is still very small, and when the vast majority of people use only, as it were, survival energy, there isn't the same kind of feeling at all. So essentially, I do think that until the West figures out that it has to lower its energy consumption, and when I say energy consumption, I mean that all kinds of energy, not just
Mm.
fossil fuel energy. So until they figure that out, I don't really see what action actually means.
Right. So now I have a craft question about your writing. So you write nonfiction and fiction both very well. You've been writing a lot of nonfiction for the past few years. Can we expect a novel? Is something in the works in terms of fiction? Any fiction coming up?
Well, I'm in the process of finishing a novel.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, I've been, as you say, I've been writing a lot of nonfiction, and getting away from nonfiction was really balm for my soul because, the subjects I've been writing about are all so uniformly depressing and sad. So, yes, it's very nice to get back to writing fiction.
Right.
And, it's been really, how shall I say, I, it's really been exciting to do that. Yes.
So when you write fiction, this is something that I've always wondered about because you do so much research, there's so many facts. Do you ever feel like, there's too much world to take in as a fiction writer, not as a non-fiction person? I mean, both are the same person, but I'm saying when you write fiction, do you feel that you need to distance yourself from the world a little bit?
I mean, when you're writing fiction, you're in a different kind of space that only writers of fiction or poetry or music can be in. And one should never forget that. You can't make fiction into, as it were, the sugarcoating for research or for, a whole world of facts. I don't think anyone would want to read fiction of that kind. Certainly, I would not. At the same time, you can't forget the real world that's around you,
Right.
and this world is intruding upon everything all the time. So once you see that reality, you can't really unsee it, for the
Yeah.
sake of writing fiction or whatever. You have to try and find some way of bringing them together.
Thank you so much for talking to us, sir. This was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Vineetha. Thank you very much. Very good conversation.
Lovely
Thank
to have
you.